Welcome to Radical Feminist Perspectives. Today, we are going to hear about Abra by Joan Barfoot, discussed by Laila Namdarkhan. So thank you so much, Laila, for being here and sharing this with us, and over to you.
Good morning, everyone. It's a real pleasure to be back here again to address you all and be with you all. And I hope you find what I've got to say interesting. And I'm aware that there are people, women joined who are not from England or UK. So there might be names and places and things that don't chime with you. But I can only speak from my own experience here. I'd like to start off with talking a little bit about our history to do with bookshops and book libraries that were feminist and were set up by women for women. I left the WDI UK event on Monday in London, and while I was walking up to get the underground to Leicester Square up Charing Cross Road, memories came flooding back. Lots of memories of visiting the Silver Moon bookshop, which was a haven for women of all stripes. As their history moved on, it became more and more inclusive of all women, not just from UK, but globally. So I want to talk a little bit about why those bookshops were important. It's our heritage, it's our history, it's our present, and hopefully at one point our future will see these shops opening again. So Silver Moon opened in 1984 by Jane Chomley and Sue Butterworth, a small business bookshop set up in Charing Cross Road. It was wall-to-wall books written by women. It had a cellar where meetings took place, where women could come, where women could save up money like I did. If I knew I was off to London in a few weeks' time, I would save up money and have a spending spree in the Silver Moon. That's why I have such an extensive range of books by women, feminists, radical feminists, and fiction. And it's sad that due to pressures of London developing, obviously, in 2001, both Jane and Sue had to make a decision and to close the bookshop. The bookshop then was transferred to Foyles, which was further up the road, but that's a generalist bookstore. And unfortunately, the area for Silver Moon Books was right at the top of the building. It had really no, what I would say, kudos in terms of this is the go-to place anymore, and that itself closed in 2004. I then turned my thoughts to, well, what other bookshops are there in London and around? I did a little search, and I came up with virtually nothing. Those who are listening today might have some better idea of how many or how, if they know of women-only bookshops that sell entirely women-only books. Silver Moon itself, the name, was chosen from the two symbols of womanhood from a poem by Sappho, as both women who set up this wonderful bookshop were lesbian. I met them on several occasions while in the bookshop, and I knew Jane Chomley's sister. She was a leading light locally here in the soroptimist movement. And we used to talk happily about her sister, me knowing them both, and so on. So when it closed, it was a great loss. They published books as well as stocked just about all kinds of books you could imagine. Lesbian fiction, non-fiction, they sold jewelry, and in fact the earrings that I'm wearing now, I bought them and I bought them in silver, And as time went on, there is a story behind them, which I won't have time for today, but I donated them to someone who wanted them. And before that, I had these. These were these were made by a goldsmith in 22-karat gold, and they haven't been off my ears since, and that's 20 years ago. So the bookshop had many functions. The loss of such spaces for women, like many of the other spaces, cannot really be calculated, only in memory. And memory for these things, I think, is really important. When I looked at what bookshops are still left, there's a bookshop called Persephone, but they in London, in Bloomsbury, but they publish their own books. They don't stock books by women, but they do publish books themselves by women. There's also another bookshop in Soho, London, called The Second Shelf, which upon its shelves, they have secondhand books, women's books. I don't know if they have mixed books within their shop, but these are antique books by women. Sister Right was also a bookshop at that time, and they opened in 1978, and they were in Islington, and they had a cafe, and the cafe was called Sister Bite. We were so clever at how names were orchestrated in those times. But it was a hub for the local lesbian community, but unfortunately they closed in 1993. If such a bookshop was attempted to be opened today, I think it would cause eruptions. I don't think we would be allowed to do business. We would be daubed with slogans of TERF and all kinds of things, because if we did not include gender politics and trans issues, we would not be seen to be inclusive. We cannot, as women, although we are 50% of the world's population, we can't have our own things, and that is still a fact. There was an article that I read by, article dated 2020, that by Moira Crockett in Stylist magazine, and she stated that she felt that the women's bookshops were coming back, but unfortunately, I think she's not quite correct there. There may be bookshops that hold women's books, but there is no dedicated shops for them. The idea that somehow you can put women's books into a general bookshop and say that they're a feminist. I mean, I've been into bookshops and said, could you point me to the feminist bookshelf? And and they look at you. No, you can go to sociology, go to gender politics, go to queer politics, go to this, go to that, but nothing now under the heading. I'd like to know if anybody listening today has experience of finding a section, even in the library. My local library has LGBTQI section. It has sections for people who collect stamps and everything else, but it doesn't have a feminist book section in the library. And if you want a specific feminist book, you have to order it. It's not something you can just pick up off the shelf. So then we had the publishing, and of course we had Virago, and we had Boudica Press, and the Women's Press. And the book I'm going to start talking about soon is one that's published by the Women's Press. I have so many of these books, and they are very striking. As you can see, they have this wonderful sort of ziggy-zaggy kind of black and white symbolism, and they have a picture of an iron on it, which is obviously in deference to women press. Yeah, we press for our rights. These bookshops brought women words and writings and discourse out of the shadows, providing sustenance in a desert for women about themselves. This history and so much more validated and affirmed women as central to life. The Feminist Library in London opened in 1975 by second wave radical feminists. It had many different homes during that period of history. But who would have thought in 2023 that that library would now be in disarray and have been captured by queer politics and gender identity operators. I have spoken to many of the second wave women who were volunteers at the Women's Feminist Library in London, and they're dismayed by what's happened to their heritage, to their work. And it's as if somehow this cultural revolution, much like other cultural revolutions, has pushed women into oblivion again. The volunteer supporters had many years standing. We did marshal a campaign to get some sanity back into the library, because the gender equality policy and the trans policy was hugely exclusive of women who did not agree with that level of politics, of feminist, allegedly feminist politics. Ophelia had a couple of conferences ago, had asked the Feminist Library in London if they could have some of their artifacts for display at the conference, and they were told that they're bigots and they are TERFs, and they don't deal with TERFs. They make it quite clear, and they tell everyone that they're transphobic. In April 2022, in an unheard article, Julie Bindel wrote about this issue and said that she termed that the Feminist Library had now been corrupted. And again, another space, women who do not agree with gender politics and trans ideology are prohibited from having meetings at the Feminist Library. So we are told that we are no longer wanted there as well. The sad part of it is that there we were in what I might consider to be a purpley, sparkly age, where women's bookshops, where women's library, where you could get your books off your general library if you didn't live in London or one of the biggest cities. It's now gone. And there we are, back in the shadows again, back in invisibly. So important. And I wanted to say that because we need to gain, maybe we need to start another feminist library. Maybe we need, I know Ophelia has begun to work on this idea again. And it just goes to remind us that once having something, it's not sustainable always, that there will always be threats against what we try to achieve, as in other areas of second wave endeavor, rape crisis, women's refuge, women's centers. Many of them have been taken over by the trans ideology. So this, I just wanted to say how important that was. It's important to me, and I'm sure to you all, that our history, our legacy, both now, in the past, the present, and in the future, is retained for our future generations of women, where they have a place where they can access all this stuff. And if they have to pass certain and jump through certain hoops to validate their thinking as to whether they can or they can't, that is a huge attack on our freedom of thinking as women. Okay, I'll be interested to hear comments on that and about what other people think. I think there is a way forward, but I've reached the age in life where energy is limited, and I think that younger women need to take up some of these issues. So to turn to the book, which was at the advertised bit, I don't know how many of you know Joan Barfoot's work, but I I enjoy reading her stuff, not just because it speaks to me as a woman, but because there are fictional stories that can take you to another level of thinking, and not all books written by women can do that. A story is a story is a story, that's true, but some stories are more provocative, shall I say, than others. Now, this is a small book. I mean, this is the book. If you can see. So, in presenting Abra, which is known in the UK as gaining ground, I would argue that if Friedan's 1963 book called The Feminine Mystique was the theory of the malaise of the middle class white woman's discontent and depression, then Barfoot's Gaining Ground, written in 1978, is the practice. It is the practice of one woman's journey or one woman's experience of this discontent, of this thing that is difficult. The format of the the novel's format, the very syndrome that impacts this today, the very conditions under which women survive, how to thrive, that was the question. How to thrive was not what the character Abra asked herself outright, but it was a feeling inside of her, that question. How do I survive? How do I thrive beyond survive? The patriarchal belief that the only route to fulfillment for women was as wife, homemaker, mother, carer, back then in the 1960s and 70s when these books were written. And at that time, Friedan described this state of being for women as the disease that had no name. But in the post-World War USA and no doubt Canada, many women, as research indicated, were suffering in a stultifying existence of discontent that in a material and social sense could not be explained. Women were told that in the post-war era there, the 50s, the 60s, that in the middle class arena, they had made it. They were fairly wealthy, they were comfortable, didn't need to go to work, have children, raise them. Barfoot herself was born in 1946, like myself, she'll be the same age as me this year, 77, was Canadian from Owen Sounds, Ontario. And as far as I know, she lives still in Canada, but in London, Ontario. Very little is written about her in a personal sense, in what might appear to be an unremarkable life. She was an English major at university, and she became a journalist on many notable newspapers. But during that period, she was also a writer of fiction. One brief interview on her webpage again offers little insight into her mindset while penning her first fiction, which of course was Abra. I couldn't find any information about what her inner self was thinking when she wrote the book Abra. This was Barfoot's first novel, published in 1978. I had read The Feminine Mystique, still have it, and as I read the synopsis of Abra on the back cover, I was intrigued as a feminist about how Abra did what she did. The name itself reminded me of the magic words we used to hear as children, abracadabra. Now you see it, now you don't. That was Abra. She was a suburban Canadian middle-class woman, stay-home mother of 2 children, aged 9 and 11. And then she was gone. The book has been described as a feminist wilderness novel, and to some extent that is true from my own opinion. Her secret withdrawal from her comfortable lifestyle with all its trappings was not entirely exchanged for a wilderness existence. She sets out in the first part of the novel to tell us that she was a regular character, Abra. She met and married her man from her college days. She worked while he finished college to become whatever it was. She never quite explains what he does. But whatever he does, it brings wealth into their home. They marry, children come along. And she goes into quite in-depth descriptions of that period of her life. And it's interesting that it mirrors much of my own life, and perhaps those who might read the book can see images of themselves in the book, where there are days that seem to pass by with nothing much interesting happening, where one feels that one has no real role in life other than this one that one has somehow accepted without much thought going into it. She says at some point that the crunch came, and by now the children are 9, the daughter is 9 and her son is 11. The crunch comes when she's had a really depressing day all by herself, and when her husband comes home and says, "Oh, you do realize that it's our turn to put on the dinner," and it's like the biggest groan she's ever made. It's like, oh no, have I really got to do this? I don't want to do it. I really do not want to do it. And for one of the first times, as you read the book, she stands up for herself and makes a stand by getting very upset and saying, well, these are your friends. Why do I have to do this? I don't want to do this, and so on. And in the end, they have a conversation, and she acquiesces to his demand, because in the end, he exerts himself as a patriarchal male and almost threatens her and demands that she does this. For her, that is the breaking point. She doesn't respond much after that. The dinner goes ahead. And then at some point, she sees an advert in a local newspaper for a cabin for sale. She gives it some fleeting thought, and then after a while, she sees the advert again. So obviously no one is after this cabin. So out of interest, she pretends to the family that she needs to go out of town for a few hours, and she follows up the cabin. When she arrives at the appointed place, she says she feels like she's home. The cabin comes with a large forested area, and as she says, it has all mod cons, because she does make the point as the character that she's not a camping woman. Camping has never appealed to her. So secretly, she goes about undercover, if you like, purchasing the cabin. The cabin obviously is going to cost money, so where will this money come from? Well, she's fortunate that in this story, unlike most of us, her grandmother left a legacy in a trust fund for her, possibly to use for the children's education. So she goes surreptitiously to the realtor and does the deal with the owner. She then takes the courage to tell lots of white lies about why she's buying the cabin and so on and so forth. The cabin she bought secretly with money, yes, and it's remote in an outback of Canada. She believes that what she's doing is right. And that is where I think many of the other women in around 1990, when I was in a group of online feminists, we would recommend books to read each other, or to read and then discuss. And this was one of the books that I recommended. And it was an interesting conversation that we had online about this book, because it does challenge the notion that women don't leave their children. And I think that's one of the essential messages that comes out of this book, is women who do leave their children behind. She plans this as if she's planning a war, basically, if you like, or a secret service expedition, because nobody knows what she's doing. She goes to the bank, she takes all the money out of the trust account, much to the horror of the cashier. What are you going to do with all that money? Well, I'm purchasing a property and the owner wants cash. That was in the days before money laundering, obviously, because she won't be able to do that now, I don't think. She organizes herself and she sets a date for her leaving the family. She does that kind of weirdness, and on the day she's planned to leave, she tidies the house, makes all the beds. She makes the food for dinner that evening and puts it in the fridge. She alerts the neighbor to pick the children up so that they're there until the husband comes home. And she just leaves a very simple note. She takes very little with her in terms of the material life that she's got, rather choosing to buy what she wants from a town that's somewhere near where the cabin's located. She stocks up with food, and she says that when she's leaving, she doesn't look back. She doesn't think about the husband. She believes that she should not be looking back, and she doesn't. Critics of Barfoot accuse her of creating a female character willing to abandon not just the husband and the nice lifestyle, but chillingly abandoning 2 children, creating the question for feminists: what about the children, if you have them, as their mother? Well, sometimes I ask myself with 2 children, and I used to, well, what about the children? You know, why is it down to me? Why is it just me that has to think about this? Abra's life after this moves into the rhythm of the seasons. The first winter is harsh, but after 9 years of contentment, her life is about to change. An encounter is about to change all of that. It will roll back to her life previously. A woman too afraid of life and its demands and expectations she had found impossible to fulfill. In chapter 2, she begins by saying, it should have been obvious, it should have been obvious. One of them would turn up one day. And up the pathway to her cabin arrives her 18-year-old daughter, Katie. What follows is an examination of the past and what happens now. So from 9 years of contentment in a virtual wilderness, we are now in a situation that, although she had expected it, she had not given it much thought. When her daughter arrives at the pass, she assumes it's her daughter, but she isn't sure, because 9 years changes people. She's now 18. Abra's world has no clocks, mirrors, or memorabilia. All of those things were left behind. Time for her is a matter of seasons. And so her children and thinking about them had stopped when she left. She prepares for long winters by freezing her homegrown produce and felling trees to chop into logs for her open fire. So here she is now presented with her teenage 18-year-old daughter. The daughter steps into this self-contained world shocked, hardly recognizing her mother. And Abra herself has no real knowledge of her appearance. But during her first year in the cabin, she believes she has a breakdown in which she cuts her hair without a mirror. She goes through dream-like sequences, imagining all sorts of things going in her life, and the harshness of the winter, and keeping warm, and keeping herself together. The two women spend 7 weeks together. Abra's lifestyle does not change. She accommodates her daughter, who stays in a motel in the nearby town. She visits on a daily basis. Abra mulls this over. She has to ask her, well, what do you want? What do you want from me? And of course, the question is, why did you leave? Why did you leave us? Why did you leave me? When I read those parts of the book, it was like the narrative was an awakening, a form of an awakening, deeply rooted in Abra's reality, but at the same time, it is, for me, an altruistic story that many women could not achieve. I had, as I said before, once recommended the book to a group of women who called themselves feminists. Some felt it was a novel opening up possibilities. Others were angry, really visibly angry, viscerally angry at the idea that even as a feminist, with all of those liberated alleged views, if you had children, you didn't leave them behind. You didn't go and do your own thing. You didn't do that sort of thing. That was beyond. And of course, at that time, in the feminist canon, we had few books that talked about that dilemma, that juxtaposition of being feminist and being a woman and a mother. And what did that mean? And many of us would have already had children when we entered second wave. So our choices were a bit difficult to make in terms of the rejection of the children that we'd already got and had been groomed, if you like, by society to get attached to. How do you detach? How does this happen? How can it happen? I remember in the discussion saying that I felt Abra as a character and as a message from Barfoot was being brave. But this was altruistic. I don't know if I could have done that myself. I don't know if any women here today hearing this would have been able to do that. And I guess some of the current belief is, I know with my granddaughter, there's lots of discussions about, do I really want children? Because then you don't have to live within the framework of the mother that is set within our society. Even today, despite feminism, it's the work of women. There's no doubt about it. Globally, it is rearing children and giving of yourself is the role of women. People thought Abra was selfish, egocentric, awful. What an awful woman. How? Fancy spending the money on it. Fancy doing that. Fancy using the children's education money to do something for herself like that. And just going. What the book does, it challenges orthodoxy of how women are supposed to live their lives. The final stages of gaining ground reveal just how the pull of wanting to please others as a woman can return just like that. Even the most freedom-seeking woman the days come and go with the daughter. She accommodates the daughter. And there's a sequence in the book where the daughter has left and she's going to come back the next day after the first encounter. And for some reason that even astonishes Abra herself, she busies herself making a cake, something that she hasn't done for a very, very, very long time. She makes the cake. She uses her valuable eggs making the cake. She wants to please her daughter, but she doesn't want to admit that she's pleasing her daughter. She feels it's an act of hospitality, but that's what you do if you have visitors. Because the visitors she's had in 9 years are few and far between. The husband did appear in the first year. He managed to track her down, and track her down he did. And he arrived again up the path, unannounced. And obviously he was very shocked to see his wife, as he called her, because at that time they were still married. And he had been able to track her down because there had been a phone call to the house by the buyer of the property, who owned the property, asking, did everything go well? Are they satisfied with the cabin? Was everything okay when they arrived there? So he was able to ascertain where she was. And again, he's demanding to know why she left. How could she do that? More sort of accusations of selfishness, and how can you go and do what you want to do in this way, leaving me and the children? Abra stands her ground, and I think that's probably one of the reasons why in UK the book is called Gaining Ground, because this is how it works for her. She gains ground, and so she is able to stand her ground in the latter parts of the first year when he turns up and says, you need to come home, like as if she was a naughty child, you know, saying, yeah, right, well, you know, you've had your fun, you know, you made your point, life can be different, you know, we can do it differently, you know, blah blah blah, and all the rest of it. And she said, no, I'm not coming. This is my home, this is my life. And the only other thing that happens then is that he leaves. Excuse me. She leaves, and then the next thing, the divorce papers arrive. Obviously, she signs them, and as far as she's concerned, that's another line drawn under. In fact, when she left, she never thought about divorce or legal matters or any of that stuff, or worried about her rights or not rights in according to the house that they own. These things were not her concern. The daughter's time, when the daughter arrives, the second visit, they sit and they have tea, all very nice, and piece of cake. And of course, the questions come, and quite often Abra has no answer. There are long silences between them. And these silences make Katie, the daughter, angry. She expects her mother to have all the answers ready for her. But of course, having lived for 9 years in her wilderness space, very content, very at one with her decision, very at one with the lifestyle that she's chosen, and the peace and quiet and the changing seasons, she finds it difficult to explain how that decision was made, like it was made on that difficult day that broke everything. She calls it being broken. She recalls the conversation she had with her husband during a row, that the cracks appeared. The struggle couldn't end here. It was not possible to stop, although with the understanding the old Abra had to disappear, and I was in charge of the questioning, no one else. I never, in all the restless burrowing, considered going back, never once felt an impulse to return to their standards, to become a grown-up. That was not in any recess of my mind as a possibility. Still, I went on into the breakdown, which is what happened to her during the first year. So here she is now 9 years later with her daughter, having to deal with the difficult questions. How does Abra resolve this dilemma? Is an inner battle perhaps the final one that she will face in her quest for the right to live as she chooses? How many of us actually live the life we chose? It brings to mind the Virginia Woolf, A Room of My Own, and the longing that Woolf had for that experience, to be free of the trappings of someone else's making, of someone else's design, of someone else's desire to define women. And I find very little of that has changed, that defining women is an occupation for psychology, for philosophers, for all sorts of different people. It seems to be an occupation, that they want to define us, they want to box us, they want us to stay in our lane and want to join us now. So we're not only contending with staying in our lane and trying to break out of it, but we're also expected to tolerate men entering the category of women. But her resolve, how is she going to solve this encounter with her daughter? Will she succumb to the demands over the 7 weeks that the daughter makes? They are seductive requests that the daughter makes. They are requests made in a loving but angry way. You know, in other words, I want my mother back. I haven't had my mother and I want my mother. And that means I want you to leave here. I want you to leave this place. I want you to come with me. And it reminds you of children who you see in the supermarket, whose mother is busy shopping and has to get somewhere else. And there's a child dragging on her trousers or her skirt saying, no, I want to go over there. I want you to come over here. I don't want you to go over there. I don't want you there. I want you here. And I recall being on the phone that I don't think when my children were small or young that I had 1 minute on a phone call where one or the other of them wasn't asking something, pulling me away, holding me and saying, come this way, I want you here. So these pulls are very strong on those of us with children. And I guess those women without children, where they find parents or siblings or those they live with or those they work with being pulled in directions that they don't want to go. Does she want to go back to a life that was totally unfathomable to her 9 years previously? To render herself invisible again? Does she think, no, why not? I'm invisible now. Why not stay invisible? Will she? That's a problem. That is a problem, I think, that many of us face in our decision making. As I said earlier about the bookshops, these shops that represented us as a class, a sex class, were about us. We hadn't had much of that. We'd had the suffragettes. They had had bookshops. There were Wollstonecraft and her book and such like. You know, there was the Brontes, and I've just been reading Jane Eyre. What a fascinating book that is. What a great novel that is to find yourself in, the questioning again of my place. Who am I? What is my purpose? Is there a conclusion to this? Well, there is, but I'm not going to spoil the ending for you because it is a fascinating ending. In conclusion, it's an absorbing story of discovery of oneself as a woman. Contrast that to the normalization of men who leave families behind for adventurous reasons or just leave. The social stigma attached to that, even in the 21st century, is nothing as harassing and as hard as women who do leave their children. The extreme measures Abra takes in order to find her identity that brings not only undiscovered physical strength, but inner peace. For women, leaving is vocalized as abnormal. The narrative is that we are abnormal because, after all, you don't leave your children. and yet, having worked in the prison system and in the system where they lock women with children up, that's okay. That separation is okay. Legally separating women offenders from their children. Very little has been done to bridge that gap, to bridge that legal break. But that's okay. That's not worried about by the establishment, because if you do the, don't do the crime if you don't want to do the time, was that it's a wonderful thing to think that a woman could actually do that, even as a euphoric moment in your head. The extreme measures she takes in order to find herself, that brings not only undiscovered physical strength, but inner peace. For women, leaving is vocalized as abnormal. Through the narrative, two events are introduced that I can only assume Barfoot introduces as a reminder. And that, getting that in the novel, you stop. They are stunning, shocking moments that somehow penetrate your thinking. One happens before she leaves her family. A school friend, the same age as herself, she hears through friends or through a phone call from someone, she has committed suicide. And to Abra's mind, it's shocking. Of course, it's shocking. And those around that horrific event cannot find a reason. And I think that's a major problem, that people do not understand the inner world of women. And therefore, when such extremists happen, they can't compute it because quite often there's no language for it. And this obviously impacts Abra, because she assumed this also that this woman had a similar lifestyle to herself. And such extreme measures were not something that Abra herself had thought of as a way out. Because believe me, that's what Abra was about, a way out. The second event is something that happened in the cabin in a previous time. That was told to her by the general store that she once or twice a year visits to stock up on her requirements. And the elderly man in the store says to her, you don't know about the people who used to live there? Well, no, I don't. I didn't ask questions, she said. Not a great one for conversation was Abra with the locals. She did not want them to infiltrate her. But she's intrigued. So what is this story? Well, this story is about a young couple who come to live in the near wilderness, and they have a child. They have a little girl. They want to grow their own food and live off the land. And they have this wonderful euphoric dream, according to the storyteller, that they had come here from the city and they wanted to be self-sufficient, and they had done everything. They had invested everything, and they hoped that they would be able to sell their produce on the roadside at the bottom of where the cabin was situated. And apparently several years of struggle amounted to nothing, that ended in femicide. The man shot his wife, the child, and then himself. Again, extremists, where women are not in control of their own lives, where they have followed someone into someone else's dreams, and those dreams had not borne fruit. And in a desperate attempt to alleviate his debts and his difficulties, the man kills his wife, child, and himself. This is a haunting story for Abra. I can only assume Barfoot introduces as a reminder of extreme consequences that surround women's complex lives and acts in order to gain acceptance. A young woman's suicide that leaves her community dumbfounded, and a femicide that takes place in the cabin. Both events haunt Abra's inner world. Patriarchy, the latter, whose victims haunt her dreams, but not as a horror event, but she sees the woman and the child in the cabin and she says, I know you are here, as if she accepts their right to be there in her mind and in her visions that she has of this awful situation. I think I have 4 minutes left, so I will conclude. Barefoot is blunt. One can get weary, not me actually, but one can get weary of the in-depth descriptions of the changing seasons and the minutiae of the natural world that are inherent in this book. But what is revered is the solace of a woman's soul, feeling herself in the vast wilderness like it was a room of her own. I came across the book in September 1987. Well, how do I know that? Because when I bought this book from Silver Moon, I wrote the date, which I had done on many occasions. It's a treasured book. I've read it several times and I get something new from it every time that I read it. So it was a real privilege for me to read this book again in the last week and to discuss some of the absorbing ideas that come out of this altruistic look. Barfoot's written many books. She's received many accolades for her books. Dancing in the Dark, I think, was one made into a film. I'm not quite sure, but there are many. She has 11 books to her credit and lots of accolades, but appears to me to be a very private woman. And she, in anything that I could find about her, she is described as a radical feminist because her first book, to me anyway, is radical. There is nothing more radical than a woman being able to turn her back on a comfortable, secure, defined life than just walking away. And how does that get resolved? I'll leave that up to you, dear reader. Thank you very much for being here today. I hope it gives you pleasure to look at the book, to read the book, and I think we've almost come to the end of our time. Yes, 1 minute to go. So all good wishes to you all.
Yeah, and I'll just thank you on behalf of everybody here. We had over 100 attendees at this webinar and loads of interesting chat. Thank you so much, Laila, and looking forward to hearing more from you very soon. Okay, bye everybody.
Okay. Bye. See?